Hi, Tracy and Ariel. Um, Thanks for being here today. I am happy to see that there are some um, some of you who are looking to hear from today's guest, Kale Cumings, president of the American Federation of Musicians Local 6, which is based here in San Francisco. This is InterMusic SF's fourth free professional development workshop. And we are just super excited to jump into today's topic, which is knowing your worth as a musician. We'll be covering the different parts of a performance contract, how to evaluate a contract, and how to negotiate for terms that work for you. Kale has over 30 years of experience as a professional trumpet player, performing with the SF Symphony, SF Opera, and Ballet, and with various Broadway productions here in the city. He's also a passionate advocate for musicians' rights, and his role as president of Musicians Local 6, he's had the opportunity to fight for fair pay, better working conditions, and for musician protections. His leadership focuses on ensuring that musicians' voices have power within this industry that we all work in and around. Today's workshop series is a part of our professional development workshop series. Each spring, we offer free workshops and public workshops that are used to provide practical, usable guidance on a variety of topics that include some of the things that we'll be talking about today. We hope that you will provide feedback for these services so that we can adjust accordingly. So please watch out for the survey and fill that out. We listen to what you say. And we are honored to have Kale speak today. And without further delay, I'm going to let him take things over from here.
Okay, thank you very much, Crystal. I appreciate that. I'm not sure who wrote that introduction, but I should get a copy of that. I really do appreciate that. So welcome everybody. I'm glad to see you and anyone who might be checking us out later after the fact on video. As Crystal said, we'd like to talk a little bit about contracts. Most of my experience is with union contracts, just because that's my job now. But there are some similarities between union contracts and frankly, any other contract. We certainly can go through that and talk about that. And also, I want to spend some time to talk about and discuss different aspects that go into the process of negotiation. Negotiation in itself is one of those endless rabbit holes that you could go down forever studying. But it's also a relatively simple reality, and that is it comes down to two human beings trying to find something that they can both agree to. That's really what it comes down to. And it's interesting to me, after having done most of what I do now with my time is negotiate contracts. And it's always fascinating to me how even after all that time and even after all the training and you go through everything, it really just does come down to how well you can interact with another person and work something out. So a lot of that from that perspective is more or less intuitive. Ariel and Tracy, I see you here. Would either of you like to talk to us a little bit about your experience and what maybe you're looking for from today's workshop? Or would you prefer I just keep talking?
Hey, Ariel.
Hi,
Hi,
Ariel.
Hey, just thought I'd say hi. Also, I haven't seen Crystal and Mark in like a bazillion years, so really happy to see you guys. Yeah, I guess
Oh,
there's
hold on one sec, Ariel. We're just getting your audio here in the room. It's very high tech over here.
oh,
No.
I'm gonna be in the room. Oh God. Okay. That's not what I expected, but that's fine. Um, cool.
Can you try talking one more time?
Yeah, hello?
Nope. We
Check.
can't hear you in the
Go.
room, but hold on.
Does anybody know sign language?
Hello?
Hey, there
There
we
you
go. We
are.
can hear you now.
Hey. Um, yeah, there's just I'm so excited about this because I kind of gave up on I do mostly like kind of wedding contracting, which is a slightly different thing. But there are a lot of different kinds of of contracts out there, and I was just curious also, like, if you've ever done stuff with with like touring bands and stuff like that, and just if there's a difference from doing kind of more, I guess, like temp work compared to, I'm assuming, something like, SF Symphony or opera. They're much longer term contracts, and I was just curious if you're going to also touch on other kinds of contracts, or if there's really a big difference in your experience.
That's a great question. Thanks, Ariel. So, and I will answer your question. I'm just have a couple more for you before we get there. When you say you do mostly wedding contracts, you're working with a coordinator or wedding planner, and you're providing the music.
Yeah, basically stuff like that. And I've done like orchestra work, but I do more the freeway fill thing than actually, under contract with any. So a lot of my, I guess, like contracts are really like you do it for one day,
Right.
which, and then there's
Yep.
something, I'm guessing, in between that and the SF Symphony, and I'm guessing tours and stuff. They're more like three,
Yep.
yeah,
Yeah.
just the whole rigmarole.
Yeah. Okay. Well, uh, I'll answer your question from two vantage points. One, from the vantage point of the work that I do with the union, uh, we do have a contract with San Francisco Symphony, and you're right, it's a longer term contract. In fact, there's never a point in time when that group is not under contract with us. So typically, we would negotiate a 3 year, sometimes even up to a 5 year contract, and then when that particular contract comes up to the end of its term, we will sit back down at the negotiation table, usually 4 or 5 months before the end of the term, and hash out another one. And if all goes well, by the time the term ends, we'll have another contract to sign, and it just keeps going forward perpetually like that. In the union world, in the American Federation of Musicians, the kind of work that you're talking about, where it's not guaranteed to happen over and over again, it just happens one time. Um, the word for that in the union in the union world is called casual, and I'm not quite sure why how that happened, but I'm pretty sure it happened in 1932, and it's been around since then. So one of the things, this is an aside, but one of the things that I am trying to do as a union leader is to bring our union and our entire mode of thinking into how the world is working in the 21st century. And sometimes that's easy, sometimes it's not. But one of the things is we do have this sort of realm of terminology that is stuck with that. So for whatever the reason, we refer to that as a casual work. And uh, in the union context, we just have a contract. I would show it to you, but it's hardly even worth showing, because all it says is your name, their name, the information that you need in terms of what time you have to be there, what time you're going to play, when you're going to show up, and how much everybody is getting paid. And then there's usually also a section in there that will prohibit or define how that can be used via recording or exhibiting later. For the most part, we think of recording as happening as there being two elements to recording. One is the capture moment, where you're actually doing the work of being in a studio or outside, or even whatever here. uh, that would be one component to think about. And then what we call use, and that is, well, what are you going to do with it? So for instance, if you're a musician and you play for a Hollywood movie, you're working for Universal on their soundstage in in I think that's in Burbank, anyway, in LA somewhere. um you would show up and you would get paid for that session that you're playing, and they would think of that as a casual. You get paid for that session, but then you also uh get paid as a part of a system of residuals that happen depending on how that's used. So I think in your context, we're probably talking about not as much recording. Am I right about that?
I do a fair amount of I do a fair amount of recording as well, and I was actually I saw Tracy in the chat had also kind of touched on something on I was also curious about too that's related, just how to protect musicians as say your group is getting bigger, or like if you're recording for a group that's like like say is like really small but then they blow up. How do you like and just the whole realm. Like I feel like especially when it comes to things like recording, in some senses that can be like pretty casual, at certain levels. And yeah, it's like how do you kind of especially if you're working with a friend, how do you kind of protect yourself while also negotiate all the interpersonal stuff and the many layers of recording and performing and all of that, and touring with a group for and whether you're like officially a part of a group, what does that mean versus like if you're just kind of I'm a violinist, so I feel like I'll suddenly be in a group and then all of a sudden they decide that they're gonna shrink when they go on tour, and then I'm not in the group, like just
Yeah.
I guess all the various nuances
Yeah.
with
Yeah.
all of that.
Oh, can I add
Yeah,
something
Crystal.
to that? I just want to share that total sentiment because I hear you so loud about like, where do you draw the line? And I feel like something that happens a lot in those contexts is that you say that recording is okay, but then there's like a video camera. And it's like, oh, we're videotaping, like this is being video recorded. And so it just becomes like it's so much, every layer is a different layer of kind of expectation for a performer. And I feel like those boundaries get crossed a lot. And so it's so great to know how you can kind of write that into your contract and be sure you know what you're entering and know that you're protected. Like I didn't actually say that and it says it here in my contract. So just adding to that a little bit, like the element of video.
Absolutely. I mean, I would be out of a job if everybody was straightforward and clear cut with how they treat their musicians. I mean, to be honest. Um, and I really don't mean to try to focus too much on the union aspect of it, but I that's where I work, so that's what I'm most familiar with. Um, when you're in a situation where maybe your contract says no recording and you see somebody out there with a video recorder, it's tough to know how to deal with that. One of the benefits of working sort of beyond yourself, like with a union or something like that, is you wouldn't have to be the heavy in that situation, and somebody else could say, tactfully, hopefully, but uh, I've had to do this many times where you just say, I'm really sorry, but this is not something that we agreed to, and we can't have that happen now. There are a lot of times when, before you get to the place, I will ask the presenter or the producer, whoever's there, okay, you're not going to do any recording, right? And they will say, yeah, no recording. We're not going to do that. And then 10 minutes before the show starts, they say, oh, by the way, do you mind if we record this? And that's a hard time that you have to say to them, actually, yeah, but the best way I know to respond to that, to a presenter or a producer, that and it's something that people don't often think about when they're thinking about musicians, but that is that recording that you're doing, that's my product. That's what I use to make a living. And if you take it and exhibit it without me being able to participate in any revenue stream. Now, granted, most of the time people are putting it on social media, and it's hard to tie that up directly to a revenue stream. But if somebody's using some content that you created on their social media and they're expanding their subscriber list and their following, they are eventually making money on content that you provided. So it's not, in theory, it's not a difficult concept to be able to say to them, this is my product and you don't own it. I'm performing for you right now. That's part of what you get, but what you're paying for is a live performance. If you want to pay for a recording, then we can talk about that and we can work out the terms for that. And I'm happy to work out the terms with you. We do that all the time. Um, I have had to do that quite often. I want to talk just a touch, and maybe here's the best place to talk about it. I can tell that I'm going to be stumbling across this union element all night, but one of the reasons that I work for a union in this work is that when you get down to the point where it's you, one musician, and you're bargaining a contract with a company that hires acts for weddings, or a company that hires acts for anything, it's one musician versus usually a whole team of lawyers. uh, that's a rough balance, and in my estimation, the way I look at that is that's a very severe power unbalance, a power imbalance. Is that a word? Okay, thank you for that. That's a really big power imbalance, and the way that it happens in our society, or actually in our work event, you talked about the San Francisco Symphony. We can talk about how they got to the point where they have a contract, but the way that happens is for musicians to band together. You don't need a union to do that. You can, if you do use a union to do that, uh, it's helpful because there's a lot of labor law and a lot of legal protections that you have from being associated with that. But the concept is the same. The concept is, if you find enough of your colleagues that are also doing the same kind of work and also struggling with the same kind of situation and also dealing with the same sorts of questions that are not answerable, or even things that they're being taken advantage of on the job, um, you find enough of the people that are doing that work, and as a group you go to the coordinator or the presenter or whatever and say, these are the people that you're using, and we all are going to stick together and demand a better working relationship or demand a better situation. That becomes incredibly hard to resist, and it balances out your negotiating power. I would like to think that negotiation usually boils down to people being rational and helpful and working together. It hardly ever does. Most of the time, it's people with more power taking advantage of people with less power. So there is an aspect to any negotiation that if you walk into it without any power, your possibilities are going to be limited, and you're going to be more or less dependent on the goodwill of the person you're negotiating with. That's why the work I do is to try to identify uh, people that are working in similar situations, hook them up together so that we can build power, so that when they have a chance to negotiate these contracts with whoever they're working with, they have the actual power to be able to have a legitimate seat at the table. My perspective is I believe that every worker in America, I mean, if you think about it, we spend so much of our time working, and it's a big part of our lives. America is a society that's supposedly built on a concept of having inherent rights. Um, I believe that one of those should be that we have a voice in how we spend our time. We have a voice in how we live our lives. And to me, that includes at work. So I don't believe that a musician or a worker should be able to dictate terms, but I do believe that a musician or a worker should always be able to negotiate over those terms, especially what's protected by labor law, which is working conditions and wages. So that's a little bit of the background for why I do what I do. But the idea of a contract is the same no matter if you're working in a collective bargaining situation, which is what we do, or if you're working just an individual contract. I'd like to say most people, when I talk to about negotiation, uh, uh, have an idea that if you learn this 5 or 6 tricks or little things that you can use, you'll get whatever you want, or you'll win your negotiation or something like that. In the day-to-day real life world, I have not found that to be true. uh, uh, I think you certainly can get better at doing that, but for the most part, that's a direct function of how comfortable you are, how much power you have, and a lot of those things don't happen until you just have some experience. So we can definitely we'll dive into that quite a bit more. Tracy, you want to read what you said too? So far, mostly good experiences. Contract nuances from the viewpoint of looking out for the musicians in our group. Okay, thank you, Tracy. That's good to know. Ideally, that's what contracts are for. When you're negotiating your contract for your people in your group, you want to make sure that all the bases are covered and that everybody's going to be safe. There is a certain truth to the fact that some of those things you have to learn through experience, because everybody has their own idiosyncratic set of needs. Every group does, every band does, every person does. So there are some times when, if you have a diva in your group that can only eat green M&Ms, you have to figure that out, how to figure that out to get that negotiated into your contract. But under normal circumstances, there are a basic set of things that you want to take care of in any contract. We can look at, I brought along a sample collective bargaining agreement that we'll look at in a little bit, and that will help us even see some of those things. Okay. Sorry. Well, actually, let's just get into the viable elements of a contract. I think that will help us talk about this before I show you the collective bargaining one that we have. Some of the main things that you want to make sure are taken care of in any contract. One, your payment terms and schedule. This is important because very often I've seen contracts that will list the payment rates, but not take care of how and when that payment is supposed to happen. By California law, they have a certain amount of time that they have to make any payment in. It's an algorithm, but for the most part, for most of the time, it's about 2 weeks. But if you negotiate an individual contract, you can negotiate a different paid rate and also a different schedule for the payment that would go outside or inside of that. So I have seen, in worst case scenarios, I have seen some companies say that because the payment was said and the language in the contract said that the payment was going to be made after the services were rendered, that constituted an exemption from the California state law, and they did not have to pay right away, and they wanted to wait up to 3 months to pay. We actually fought them on that, and it turns out they were wrong. You can't avoid California law like that, but that was what they were trying to do, and that's why it's very important to make sure that the schedule is a big part of how you put that in there. Also, if you have needs about how you need to be paid, like direct deposit, check, however you want to do that, that's a good idea to keep that in your contract. Those sorts of terms and realities about the details of how the payment's going to get to you, those typically are not difficult negotiating points. So you don't really even need a lot of power to say that. My best suggestion for how to actually negotiate that is to just say, this is how it is. Just put that in the contract. Sometimes when you have pushback, then maybe you have to make some adjustments. But for the most part, what I've seen is if you put in your contract, payment will be made within 5 days of the service direct deposited to musician's account. Most of the time, they won't even know to complain about that. And then, we got the special lighting. And then after the fact, once the contract's signed, if they come back to you and say, wait a minute, we want to pay this way, you can point to them, well, this is not what you agreed to. Another, okay. Okay, all right. Do you want to do questions? We could do that.
Yeah,
sure.
When you're talking about negotiating for you, is that usually like email, or is it a call, or what does that actually look like? Because a lot of the times I feel a little shy about standing up for what I need in the moment like that. That can be really difficult. So
Yeah.
just like going back to what you had said just a second ago.
Yeah, yeah. That's a great question. And let's just deal with it now. It can be difficult to just stand up there, especially if you feel like it's just you against the world or you against the whole company, for sure. A lot of just speaking from a very personal perspective, a lot of the strength that I feel when I'm negotiating is knowing that I'm working on behalf of a bunch of musicians that are behind me. Yeah. And it's not just one guy saying whatever he's saying. But one of the things that I have found in that situation is that the sort of body language, or if you're in an email, the sort of stance, the language that you use. I'm trying to think of a word here, that the tone of your email, that does a lot of work for you. And if you are able to present yourself even when you're terrified inside, and this is really interesting because as performers, we already know how to do this in a lot of ways. Right. We perform with we're there to do our job and we're focused on it. And even though we're nervous, we know how to do what we need to do. If you can find a way to channel that place in your negotiating, I found one of the most powerful elements of a negotiation is somebody that can just confidently, without tension or nervousness in their voice, state their needs. Worst thing that can happen is they say no. And if you state them almost in a sort of like laundry list, grocery list sort of fashion, not as like difficult points to bargain over, but just, oh yeah, here's what we're going to do. Then it puts the ball in their court to do the socially uncomfortable thing of saying no to you. Right. And that is more difficult than you might imagine. Certainly if you're working with a big company, they've got people that say no all day long and are quite happy to do it. But if for the most part, if you're just talking to somebody that's maybe you've got, negotiating a contract with a musician is one of 700 parts of their job. And you can get to the place where you channel that performer in you and just state very calmly and clearly what you need. They will accept the energy that you start out with. That's been by far my experience. And it's kind of stunning to see happen too, because I've been in situations where people have told me they will never agree to this. And I say, okay, let's see, let's just try. And you put it between item 3 and item 6, and pretty soon they agree to it before you even know it. Yeah, right. Here, sign this real quick. Yeah. But that's a great question. The other part of your question that you asked is, how does that happen? For me, because I'm mostly negotiating collective bargaining agreements, which are sort of expansive in term. We're negotiating over a lot of details for a contract that's going to cover a lot of work for a period of 3 years. So there's a lot of details that need to be worked out. In that situation, most of the time I'm actually sitting at a table across the table from them, like you and I are doing right now.
Okay.
Of course, during COVID, all of our negotiations switched to Zoom, and we're finding that a lot of them are now going back to in person, but we still have about half that are still on Zoom. I prefer in person because, like I said at the very beginning, it really is just an interaction with two human beings.
Yeah.
And it's easier to give that give and take feel and the energy, and to be able to communicate really well and see people's eye contact and see people's body language when you're actually sitting there. It's not impossible on Zoom, but it's more immediate in person, I find.
Yeah, that doesn't surprise me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I will say too that a lot of times, even if a negotiation starts at the table, there will be times where some things get negotiated over the phone. I've done complete negotiations by email.
Yeah.
All of that is, it runs the gamut of anything, because it doesn't, the method of communication is not as important as what you're communicating. But I think one of the biggest pieces of advice I could give to somebody who's nervous about saying what they want to say is, if you express that nervousness about what you're asking for, it's going to get broadcast as, I don't really deserve this.
Well, the other thing
Or
too
I
is,
shouldn't really go for that.
another thing is, if you go through this process and you have your contract for live performance, you have your contract for recording in a studio, you have, things that you've done, environments that you've worked in, and you know what you need. It seems like, you do a larger project of revamping all of your contracts. You start using them and people agree to them.
Yep.
Your confidence builds
Yep.
each time that those terms are accepted. You make adjustments as, you and your players kind of feel, we really needed a break after 3.5 hours,
Right,
like
right.
maybe we should push our break time, or to be larger or more, whatever, make your adjustments. But, it's like, this is our contract. My
Right.
contract is always this. And it's really interesting to think about, getting together with other people who have similar needs and using the same terms over and over that will work, because it becomes even larger, even more acceptable. Like,
That's right.
this
Yeah.
is how this community does things. And
Mhm.
so if you want to do work with, good musicians in this area, these are their terms. That kind of concept is really empowering.
Yeah. That's the concept that the union idea is based on, is a group of musicians in an area getting together and say, if you want to hire a musician from this area, this is what that means. This is what the work conditions are going to be. This is how much we typically get paid. This is what it's going to cost you in this area. I mean, whenever you go to any area, the cost for everything that we buy is variable according to the area. And what very often happens, and unfortunately is true in San Francisco, is you win what we refer to as the race to the bottom, where somebody that's, maybe they've got a bar and they're looking for live music on the weekends. They'll call somebody, and that person will say, we'll pay for this amount. And they'll find somebody else that said, well, we really want to work. We really want the job. We're not doing anything Saturday night, so we'll play it for hardly anything. And the bar hires them. And then over the years, we train the industry, we train the people that are out there spending money on it, that musicians don't cost that much. And the only thing that's going to turn that around is if musicians start saying, no, actually, we are more expensive than that.
I was scolded as a young musician for taking
Yeah.
gigs at a certain level. Like, the kids who are just a few years older than me, like, would be like, you cannot do that. Do you
Yeah.
understand what you're doing to all of us when
Yeah.
you play that gig? So I totally feel
Yeah.
that. Race to the bottom. That's rough, man.
But that's that reality, to turn that around requires a community. You cannot do it without a community. And that's why the most important element of all of this even though it's not always available to us, but the most important element of all of this is the community of musicians. If the stronger and more solid the community is with each other, the stronger and more power you have in the negotiating process, and the stronger and better your contracts are going to be, because the person you're working with has to know they can't go down the street and get another flute player for half as much. The other aspect of that, of course, is quality, and that's always what we're talking about too, because very often we will hear people say, well, I could get a student to do that or something, and my answer is always the same. If you're looking for a student, go ahead, get a student. But a professional musician is going to cost money, because a professional means that this person is making their living doing this, or building up to that place, and it's not cheap to live around here. And that's just a reality. It's not a reality that musicians invented. And I feel a lot of times we as musicians, especially struggling performers at the beginning of our careers, feel like it's our fault that we're as expensive as we are, that we should be as expensive as we are. So we play a job for $40 and a glass of beer, realizing that it doesn't even cover our gas to get there and back, and somehow feel like it's our fault for not getting better work. And I understand that. I mean, I put my time in too. I get the deal. But the stronger we can get as a community, and that's why I think organizations like yours are so great, is because the better we can build, and my organization too, the better we can work together and build the community of musicians that are not going to be willing to put up with these terms, the better we're going to be in a place to actually change what the real working lives of musicians are like. Yeah, great question. I love that question.
Also, I just want to reiterate that our attendees, you are more than welcome to unmute and join in. You don't even have to turn on your cameras if you don't want to. You're very much the center of this conversation, and so feel free to participate as you'd like.
Yeah, please do. I don't really give very many lectures. I mostly just talk with people, so that's easier for me too.
I'm dropping topic by topic as we go into the chat as well. So,
okay, so we were talking about main elements that should be included in mostly every contract. Sorry to you guys.
No, it's great.
Not at all. No, that's a good question. Okay, so the first one is make sure that you got all of the details you need around the payment terms and the schedule of when the payment's going to happen. The second one is to make sure that there's real clarity about the scope of services. Make it very clear about what time you want to start, what time you want to stop. Make it clear what happens if you go over that time. If the typical protocol for us would be something like a 3-hour set, and any time over that 3-hour set is going to be, what we would normally do is that would be in 15-minute increments, prorated at time and a half. So we would schedule that by figuring out how much you were making for the 3 hours, figure out an hourly wage from that, figure out what you were getting paid every 15 minutes from your regular 3-hour set, and then time and a half for 15 minutes of overtime. So in our contracts, if it goes over 1 minute, you get paid for a 15-minute block. If it goes over 14 minutes, you get paid for a 15-minute block. If it goes over 16, you're into the second 15-minute block, and you get 2 over what we would call overtimes. But it's really important to make sure that the scope of your services is clearly defined. It's not as important what is defined as it is that it's clear, because you will find, and you probably already have found, that this area is one of the most common areas that abuses tend to happen. Somebody will say, I know we contracted you to start at 7, but everybody's ready to go. Can you start at 6:30? And somebody, often they will say, especially if you're playing weddings, maybe they're behind schedule by 2 hours, and they'll say, can you do 7 to 9 instead of 5 to 7? There has to be unless you want to negotiate on the fly, there has to be something in the contract that clarifies how that situation is going to be taken care of. So when you're thinking of scope of services, yes, start out with what you're planning to provide as is, but also make sure that you've given a lot of thought to how you want to deal with the situation when they ask you for a variation at the job on the fly. That's very important, because I mean, I'm sure everybody that's even played two jobs will know that happens all the time. That's a normal thing. The third thing that I would encourage you to make sure is included in your contracts is would be any technical or equipment needs you have. I've heard so many stories about people hiring a band and then turns out there's no electricity, or you know, and it's not something that they even thought about. They had a nice gazebo outside and they got a band to come in and do dance stuff, and you know, the band brought all their equipment and had no place to plug in. So it's things like that, especially if you're talking about building a contract that your group or you can use over and over and over again. Give some good thought to what you actually need from the ground up. Start with the pretend that you're walking into something with nothing at all, and make sure that you understand everything that you need, and then make sure that's included in the contract if you're going to expect them to provide that. One of the things that's very often overlooked is what we would call cartage, but if you need to bring some amps or a keyboard or some heavy equipment, you want to make sure you don't have to climb up a hill to do it, or you want to make sure that you don't have to walk up 7 flights of stairs. And so, you know, a lot of times what we will put is that we need access to the space a half hour before the service starts. Whatever you need, whatever your technical setup is, however you think about that, make sure that you've given good thought to that. And again, you can just outline those all. It's, again, this is a situation where it's more important that you have clarity about what you need than it is precisely what you need. Most of the time, people are happy to provide that, especially if we're talking about, you know, we're going to need 2 places to plug in, or 2 power strips, or whatever. Make sure that you have that taken care of. Another thing that is a little bit like scope of services, but I'm thinking about as a separate thing, just because sometimes this gets talked about outside of that context, and that is sound checks and rehearsals. Very often we see people will book a group for a particular time and never think about the fact that they want you to do a sound check beforehand, or maybe you want to do a sound check. That's more common, that's more likely, and you have to make sure that that's available to you and that it's something that's factored into your time and factored into your pay. When we're doing a union contract, if there's a sound check an hour before the show that lasts 15 minutes, we think of it as the clock starting at the beginning of the sound check, because that 45 minutes between the end of the sound check and the start of the show, it's not like you can be home doing your thing. You're on the job. You have to be there. So from our perspective, that's paid time. That's work time. It's another thing to consider. What do we have? 5? Yeah.
Yes.
The 5th thing I want to suggest that you think about is cancellation and rescheduling policies. These also end up being super important, and they end up being things that people don't typically think about. Most of our contracts, we have requirements that if the schedule changes, well, let me think of an example. For instance, if the schedule changes within 30 days, there's a certain penalty. If the schedule changes within 2 weeks, there's a higher penalty. If the schedule changes the day before, there's a cost to make that change at all. Like maybe that change won't even be possible the day before. the other thing that's really important to put in there is a cancellation policy. People have to know that if they book you for a job, even if they're in their mind, they're thinking about something that's going to happen 3 months from now, but they haven't taken the time to be really clear whether it's going to happen or not on that particular day, and they book you for it, they have to understand that by booking you, that means you can't sell your services that day to anybody else. So essentially, from our perspective, they've already bought your services. So there needs to be a cancellation policy that reflects that. For us, if you cancel somebody within 30 days, well, it's different, and that's a negotiated reality. But in 30 days, maybe you would have to pay half of what you had scheduled to pay them. Within 14 days, you got to pay 100% of what you were going to pay anyway. Yeah.
Can I add
yeah.
a little bit to that? Yeah. So what I've seen, in and around the scene is also deposits
Mhm.
for engagements. They're non-refundable. So if something does happen, then you have something to offer the musicians for lost wages from not being able to book something else on the same day. But it just brought to mind being in contract with a client and also being in contract with your musicians
yeah.
so that they know what your terms are. And maybe we can cover that at the end, but it just, maybe they're expecting something. If there's a cancellation, you want to be sure that you're in contract with the musicians and they know what happens if the gig gets canceled too, if you're the contractor.
Yeah. There are two ways to deal with that situation, that relationship that you have of being the middle person between the vendor you're in contract with, and also your musicians that you're in contract with. One way is to develop two separate contracts and just try to make sure that the one you have with the vendor is going to take care of you in the one you have with the musicians. But another way is to just have it be one contract. Have everybody sign the same contract that says this is the terms that we're going to all be working under. And then the musicians know exactly what's going to happen in every situation. When you're working in a collective bargaining environment, the latter is what always happens. We always have that agreement where everybody working under that agreement is working under the same thing, and you can see it and you can just look it up if you wonder what's going to happen. Yeah, very often, like Ariel was talking about the San Francisco Symphony contract or whatever. That contract itself is about 140 pages long, I think. So even the people that work there, my guess would be that most of them have not read that cover to cover. But hopefully it's clear enough that if you do run into a problem, you can use the index or, talk to your union representative and they can find that with you. But I find one of the things that I think is a guiding factor in all of this is that the more you can invest yourself in being crystal clear and transparent, especially to the musicians that are working for you, the better it's always going to be. The problems happen when you have an agreement with your vendor that is a little bit different than the musicians, and then something bad happens and you have to explain something to your musicians after the fact that is not what they were expecting. Yeah, that's the bad situation. And what I think one of the best ways to avoid that is to just have the complete transparency across the board. Even if you have two contracts, let your musicians see the contract you have with the vendor. Let them know what the terms are that they're working under. And that way they have a little bit more ownership over if something happens, they can see, oh yeah, this happened and this triggered this thing in this contract.
That's such a great point. I mean, to have like everyone in the same
Yeah.
on the same document is just so, that is so clear and really covers you, it's like as the person who's taking on all of that responsibility, it's nice to say like, it's right here.
Yeah. It's a big responsibility. And, I've done it myself in the times that I've done it. I've tried to be really clear and made sure I send that out to the musicians and say, this is what we're going to be working with. This is, you know, going to guide us all. If you have a problem, I need to know about it now. Let me know. Let's talk about it. Because then it comes up and they say something to me on the job, like, oh, I had a problem with this. Then you can say, we had a chance. Let's get it for the next one. But, you know, we got to deal with what we got here. But I know there's, it seems to me there's sort of two schools of thought about contracting and negotiating. One is that it should be very sort of secretive and kept behind closed doors. You and I were having this conversation a little bit earlier. The other is that it should be transparent and visible to everybody. I am so far in the second category, and I don't see why everybody else isn't. I mean, I know there's trade secrets and stuff. It gets complicated, but the more people understand, I mean, think of all those times when we've been working as musicians or whatever else we've been working at, and we're told something on the fly that's different than what we were expecting. Sometimes it's not even the difference that's the problem. Sometimes the fact that we didn't know and we weren't informed and we weren't a part of it, that's the real problem. You don't have ownership in that situation. And that goes back to what I was talking about, that I believe in, that we should have the right to have a seat at the table to say how we're spending our time at work, what conditions we're going to work under, what we're going to work for. And when you don't have that transparency, a lot of times those things sneak up on you. And then your workers or your musicians in your group feel like they're not getting all the information. That's how bad blood happens. And it just goes down from there. The other way, if everything is transparent at the beginning and you guys run into a problem with the vendor, everybody runs into that problem, not just you. It's a whole different thing. But again, for me, it goes back to one of my basic beliefs, and that is we're better together than we are apart. And it's the community, it's the group effort that really makes the difference. So I'm sorry.
No, that's all.
The cancellation and rescheduling policies, I really encourage you to think very carefully about those and be very clear. Again, I've seen so many times, this is not typically a difficult negotiating point, because most of the time when people are at the point where they're negotiating a contract with you, in their mind, they're more or less settled that they are going to do this contract. They're not thinking about canceling. They're not thinking about rescheduling. And so if you have a policy that's in place and it's clear and it's fair and it makes sense, most of the time they will accept that because they think it's never going to apply. And maybe 9 out of 10 times it won't, and that's great. But the one time that you need it is when it has to be there. So you need it there for all of those things. And the other, what are we, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 thing. I called this indemnification and liability clauses. I think this is especially important if you are one of those people that are working with a vendor and then also hiring musicians. It's not always necessary that you have liability insurance. It's not also always necessary that you carry that. Sometimes it is. My advice here is just to figure that out. Take the time. There are some places, I think there's a group called California Lawyers for the Arts.
Oh, yeah.
That will give you a free consultation on issues like this. Take the time you need to figure out what your legal exposure is in this situation and make sure it's covered in the contract, however you need that to be covered.
What is indemnification? I don't actually know that word.
Well, it's who is liable if there's a problem. Who, if one of your musicians falls and breaks their leg, do you have to pay their insurance costs? Do you have to pay their health insurance or their health care? Are you on the hook for an accident if somebody rear ends your van and destroys half of your bass player's equipment? Those sorts of things. Under most circumstances, a working musician will carry their own insurance for their instruments or whatever. But if you are a presenter, and a lot of times if you're contracting with a vendor and you're the middle person, you will be considered as a presenter in that case. You could be liable. But I mean, I want to make the really, really, really clear statement here. I am not a lawyer. This is not legal advice. Do not take any legal advice from me. I'm not, what I'm advising you is to figure out what your legal situation is and make sure if you need something in that realm, it needs to be in your contract. Mostly what I see in this case is contracts from the musician side requiring that there be a liability insurance for either the presenter or the facility that it's held at. If you're at a place that routinely hosts weddings, for instance, chances are they have a liability insurance coverage.
Yeah, a lot of
because-
them
yeah,
ask you to carry your own
Yeah.
insurance, and it's in case one of their members of the party is injured on your equipment.
Yep.
So there's a liability insurance that you can purchase online that's very, cheap, but it covers you.
Yeah, and you can buy it for 2 days. You can
Mhm,
buy
it's
it for
one
just
day,
the
yeah.
you can buy it for just the time that it's going to be there. So, but I will say this: I have seen situations where employers have tried to put off that expense on musicians or on presenting groups. In other words, when it really the
Mm.
employer is responsible for providing that liability legally, they're responsible for providing it, and they charge the performing group for it, or they require it from the performing group. So
Interesting.
again, that's why I would say just make sure, especially if somebody comes to you and it has a requirement for liability insurance, I would check with a lawyer and make sure that's not actually their requirement that
Mm.
you're paying for.
Nice. Okay.
Most of the time that it, again, not a lawyer, but most of my experience has been those liability issues rest with the venue or the facility, because I suppose most of them have to do with things happening at that location. But we have almost all of our agreements have some sort of at least instrument liability insurance included. If somebody's instrument gets destroyed because of negligence on your part, or because of exposure to asking them to play in an environment that's too cold for their instrument and it cracks, or asking them to play in an environment that's too hot for their instruments and part of their board melts or something. Those sorts of things need to be thought about and taken care of beforehand,
Mm.
in my opinion.
Environmental things should be.
Yeah, and to me, I would put that in terms of the technical requirements, but it's a really good point. Like the way we think about, I mean, there's all kinds of things to think about environmentally, and this goes back to what I was kind of saying at the beginning, when your own idiosyncrasies are going to determine a lot of what your needs are. For instance, if you're a band that plays outside, very often people forget to indicate that they need to be set up in the shade, or they need to have a covering, or they need to have protection or something like that from the sun. If that's a part of your system and you need that to happen, that has to be in the contract. That's one of the equipment requirements that you're going to need. But you're right. I mean, the other aspect about, we certainly have elements in our contract that are under no condition will you be required to play outside if it's under this temperature or over this temperature, or raining or inclement weather. Yeah, certainly all of that can go in there.
Yeah, I could see having, also those what ifs.
Yeah.
Just in case you're falling outside of what you've all decided on, but it's only 2 or 3 or 4 degrees, away. It's like, well, what do we do? Like, what is the next course of action? Does that mean that you talk to the person, do all of the musicians have to elect yes? Like, is there's just so much social pressure in the moment to do what people are asking you to do, because it's someone's, everyone is here and you're the only thing standing between, a successful performance or something. It can feel really daunting. So having those, like, I don't know, maybe that would help.
Crystal, that's a very good point, because I mean, I feel like I've known people that have used those situations to manipulate people into doing stuff that they otherwise might not be able to do. And, you know, as much as in our contracts, it's always very clear that we start at this time and we end at this time. And in the union contract, in the union working world, that really does mean when the second hand gets to the 12, that's when you start. And when the second hand gets to the 12, that's when you stop. And I've often been approached by people that say, look, there should be a little bit of grace allowed. Like, why don't you say, if we're in the middle of something, we should be able to spend the extra 30 seconds to finish it? And the answer to that is always the same. Okay, we put 30 seconds on the end. What if you get to that 30 seconds at some point in the future and you want just a little bit more? At some point, there's going to have to be a cutoff. Yeah. At some point, there's going to have to be. So the benefit of having it in the contract is you don't have to argue about it on the job. It's just there. And so you say, you know, even if everybody wants to stay later and for whatever reason, you know, they want to change things around, and you can just point to the contract and say, this is what we have, and we're not going to take a vote because this is what the contract is. Right. Then you can avoid all of that mess of being pressured into a situation where you feel compelled to say yes, even though you don't want to. One of the biggest reasons why we work hard to protect that element in our contracts is because in an orchestra or a bigger situation where maybe there's 80 people on the stage and they say, everybody who wants to do this, raise your hand. There's almost always one or two people who, I don't know, maybe they're experiencing a health condition right now that they need to, they can't stay an extra 10 minutes. They've planned out their medicine or their injection or their break or the rest, or, you know, whatever. But you would essentially be requiring them to stand up and disclose their medical situation to everybody, right, in order to justify that. And that's not a situation we ever want to see anybody put into. Yeah. So that's a good example of why the more clarity you have in your contract around these things, the easier it is to avoid those situations where you're making decisions on the fly on the road. And the truth is, even in big time contracts that have been around forever, you can't anticipate everything, and you learn by experience. And the best way to do that is to write it down, and the next time you have a contract, make sure that's in there.
Make it in there.
Yeah.
Oh, Ariel's with us. Did you have a question?
Oh, hi.
Yeah, I think it sort of got a little bit addressed, but a lot of what you're talking about happens a lot, and in my experience with weddings and recording sessions where people, especially in weddings, if you have like a, you know, like you get to time in the middle of the ceremony and then it goes an extra 5 or 10 minutes. And sometimes, like, I've had people, you know, I'll say, like, you went over time, this is the contract, this is whatever, and they will just either outright refuse to pay and just say, what's that? That's 5 minutes. We only ran over by like 5 minutes. Or, you know, you know, there's, and I guess it's like, I wonder if you have any advice for when you are in that situation, or like, I've also been in situations where, like, you know, I'll be at a wedding and like guests start showing up early, and then the planner will come and just say, hey, can you start early? And I'll say, well, then we'll have to end early, or you have to, you know, be willing to pay the whatever. And then there's like the arguing, and I feel like in those situations it's so hard, at least in recording sessions and weddings in particular, because so many of those projects are so personal and people feel very strongly about them, and sometimes it's hard in the moment to help them make the connection that they feel some way about it, but you don't.
This is work for you, actually.
You know, and
You're
it's
not
like,
the one getting
I'm
married,
really
you're
glad that your Aunt Sally got
Yeah.
so excited and showed up 15 minutes early,
Right.
and really wants to hear, you know, the whatever, you know, Beethoven 133, but
Right.
that's just not gonna happen, you know. And then, but then it's like, but then people, it's almost like, you know, people just are, they already feel bad, or they're already like upset, and it's like, in those situations, how do you negotiate it where even if you're right, people still don't feel like you're wrong, I guess.
Yeah, no, that's a
how,
that's a great question, and that happens all of the time. I think you're absolutely right. I have two suggestions for that. Number one is, this is a perfect example of the more clarity you can achieve in your contract, the better. If your contract specifically says what's going to happen when Aunt Sally shows up and they want you to start 15 minutes early, then it's nothing you have to even talk about. You can,
right.
it'll just be them saying, oh, we want to invoke this clause in the contract, or we're going to do this or whatever. With the situation, the other thing I want to say is, in that situation where, let's say that you have overtime rates in your contract and they go overtime, and then they come to you and say, well, we're not going to pay you overtime because it was just 5 minutes and it wasn't our fault, the preacher wasn't ready yet, so we're just going to give you what was there. The best sort of attitude that I found in that moment is, if you can sympathize with them and say, oh, I know, it's really sorry, I'm really sorry, these things are so hard to plan and there's so many variables that, it totally makes sense that that would happen, and I'm really sorry it's going to cost you this extra money. But it is. It's something you already agreed to. It's not my fault.
I also liked that a comment that you made earlier, which was to call the wedding planner in advance and just, or like whoever your contact, and confirm the clauses. Like, we are going to start at this time, right? You understand that in this contract, it says if we have to start early, this is what it is. Your client is aware of that. Is that right? You just confirm, because I know tomorrow's going to be so, exciting. So I want you to, just like that. I thought was really, I've never done that before. And I feel like it would be like we shook on this last night. Like, we made another like clarifying moment of, we're there, we're all on the same page.
Once you get a contract, that's an agreement that person has made with you. If they want to come back later and change the terms of agreement, that's always possible. It's just an agreement. You could always renegotiate something on the fly, but you're not obligated to. You've already negotiated that. So if they go over by 5 minutes and don't want to pay you the overtime, my attitude to them is, I'm really sorry that's such a struggle. I know you're paying for this out of your pocket. Maybe you shouldn't have agreed to it, but you did, and here we are. Yeah. So this is what it is. I have found too that sometimes in the right situation, and again, I always go back to what I said at the beginning. It's human dealing with a human. So most of the words I actually use are completely determined by the relationship I have with the person I'm talking to. And I always try to be I want to be as friendly and cordial as possible, but I also don't feel compelled to help you out of a crisis that you've created. And I don't necessarily feel compelled by your desire to put me into a socially awkward situation to acquiesce to what you're asking me for. You and I can just stand there and not talk. We'll be in the socially awkward situation together. I don't care. I'm just waiting for the check. It's not easy, but you do get better at it with practice. And it really does boil down to kind of the whole theme of what our conversation was about today. And that is when we talk about how you approach with a confident air or confident voice in your emails or something, it really does come down to the same thing. And that is, you have to believe that you're worth that. You can't demonstrate to somebody you're negotiating with that you think you're not worth it, because you're going to get paid whatever you demonstrate you think you're worth. And the truth is, if you're sitting there talking to somebody that made you play 5 minutes over because the ceremony wasn't done yet, and you can't start the recessional until they're done in recessing, you are worth getting paid overtime. You're worth it. And you have to carry that with you. It doesn't have to be angry. In fact, it never needs to be angry at all. It doesn't have to be aggressive. It doesn't even have to be assertive. It just has to be true. And you just know, yeah, I know this is hard for you, and I'm really sad that this is a difficulty for you. But it's your difficulty in the end. It's not mine. People always pay, especially when you're dealing with those kind of projects, people always under budget for those. And they're always looking, they probably said the same thing to the florist, the same thing to the caterer. They're always looking for ways to do that. So you give them a break for, $150 because they're socially pressuring you into that situation. And they get it from somewhere else and somewhere else. Maybe they save $300 or $400 or $500. That's not going to mean that much to you. But if you make a lifetime of doing that, that's going to mean a difference in living potential for you. So it really is important that your contract reflect your worth. And once you've got that established, you never, ever, ever have to back down from that. You never have to renegotiate that if you feel like they're, especially if I ever get to the place where I feel like somebody's actively trying to take advantage of me, I'm really hard to work with. You know what I mean? It's like I will do what I've agreed to do. I will still try to be cordial and everything, but I'm probably not going to work very hard to try to help you out of your predicament. And if people treat you with respect and dignity, you can still interact with them in a way that is genuinely empathetic. It's expensive to do a wedding, and somebody that has paid $10,000 more than they ever wanted to, that extra $200 to you, it hurts. It does. And it's okay. You can be there with them in their pain. You just have to remember that, number one, you're worth it. You're not asking them to do something that's not fair. You're worth it. And number two, it doesn't have to be callous to recognize that it's their predicament, not yours. Who's the kitty?
Actually, not my key. It's my friend who's also a violinist. She's in Spain for 2 months, so we're taking care of
Oh,
her little kitty. So this one's Monster. She's been kind of running around the camera, and she finally made the appearance. And
okay.
there might be a panda bear who might
Yeah.
also make an appearance, but we'll see.
So we got about 10 minutes left, apparently. Let me just go through a couple things to highlight. Oh, I'm sorry. Did you have a question, Mark?
I just want to say that everything that you've been saying, going back to what my original comment of like coming from a place of confidence, even when it's hard, is, it just like a light bulb went off. It's like, well, if you have a contract, that means you know how much you're going to be charging for your services. So just having that number very clear, and then that's just the fact of the matter. You're not apologetic. You're
That's
not
right.
like, well, how does, I don't know, 400 sound?
Yeah.
You're just like, no, this will be 7 or whatever.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And so I really appreciate hearing this, and that's actually a very empowering thing. It's very cool.
Yeah, I think a lot of times we get confused because we're so involved in setting the prices for our own services that we get confused about those are, always flexible, or we can always move around. But the truth is, many of the prices that we pay for goods and services out in the world are equally random, or at least have a random element to them. But once they're set, that's what they are.
Yeah.
And we're in the same business. You determine, a lot of the work that I do is talking to people like you and really helping them understand that you really are valuable. If you think of the hours that it takes to perfect an instrument and the level of skill that you have to develop to get to that point, not only get to that point, but maintain that level of skill. We're talking about the equivalent of what a doctor and a lawyer and those sorts of professions would be trained to do. And I don't know if you've ever told a lawyer or asked a lawyer if they'd stick around for another 15 minutes, but they almost always will, and you almost always will pay for it. So it's the same kind of thing. It's the same thing for us, the same exact thing. And I think if that helps to think of it, the most important element of that for me is that if you represent that as just a regular issue, like, yeah, this is what it costs. It's the same as saying, yeah, the restroom's down the corner. It's just a thing. It's just a reality in real life. If you represent it that way, it puts the burden on them to overcome that social awkwardness to try to argue with you about it. I do have to say, and I'm not the best person to talk about this, but I do think that this is probably easier if you're in a more privileged class in the world than if you're not. I am all the time aware of the fact that, as a relatively privileged class white male, I have access to things that other people might not, immediately. But I work with all people, and I have seen that level of confidence can be achieved and portrayed by anybody, and it carries the same weight with everybody. So I just want to real quick go through. We talked a little bit about some of these, but let me give you some ideas of some of the problems that I've seen in a lot of contracts. And I know we don't have much time, so I'm going to try to just burn through these. One I put down is ambiguous language. You probably know from my previous part of this conversation how much I said just make sure it's clear, make sure it's clear. Ambiguous language is something that you can't ever 100% completely avoid, but you should work as hard as you can to try to get to that point, because most of the problems with contracts come from one side saying this means this and the other side saying no, it doesn't. So the more clarity you can achieve, the better. The other thing that I always see, especially with contracts that are just promulgated, like not negotiated, but given to a musician to say, here, play under this, is there's all kinds of unfair payment terms, either unfair in terms of how much it is, or unfair in when you're going to get paid, or even unfair in terms of things like radius clauses, where it's a radius clause, is that? Yeah. Where, yeah, you'll get paid for this, but you can't get paid for anything else in this county for the next 6 months. That to me is unfair. In fact, the state of Washington just outlawed those radius clauses. So we're actually trying to, the local 6 is actually trying to find a state senator or assembly person that we can work with to craft a bill to do the same thing here.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've heard there's some, what are the exclusivity clauses that are ending as well, like so that you can teach at more than one school,
Yeah.
in the same area.
I think there's
And then Candlelight. I didn't know about that area.
What is Candlelight?
It's a concert series.
that was the one that we had most recently seen. Yeah. We could talk about Candlelight for next hour and a half too, if you want. I should have just brought in examples from there. Okay, I'll just try to put through these. Number 3, I wrote as lack of specificity and scope of services. And this is, again, I mean, maybe as I see this now, it looks like I just said the opposite of all the other stuff, but I do think it's important to make sure that if they're going to need you for a sound check, if they're going to want you to stick around afterwards to take a picture, anything that is going to cause you time, or mostly time, but playing or whatever, make sure that's in there. Another thing that's lack of specificity I've seen in contracts is we'll pay you this amount for rehearsal and this amount for performance, but they don't clarify that the rehearsal is at 10 in the morning and the performance is at 9 at night. And it's 200 miles away, so you got to stick around all day with nothing to do. Stuff like that is can be problematic. Number 4, I put one-sided cancellation policies. That's clear enough. Number 5, I wrote indemnity clauses that unfairly burden musicians. This is what we were talking about before, and this is meant to reflect situations where companies who are required to provide a liability insurance ask you for proof of liability insurance that they can submit to cover their requirements. You actually see that quite a bit. So they're asking the musicians to pay for something that they should be paying for. And if you don't know any better, you just assume that's part of the deal and
Yep.
you just do it. But those are the things that's why it's very good. And I already mentioned the California Lawyers for the Arts. I would encourage anybody, if you have a contract that you're not sure about that you have given to you and they ask you to sign, even give me a call. I'd be happy to look over it and tell you what it looks like to me. But for sure, you could have a lawyer look it over and they will give you an idea of whether this is, in the realm of reality or not. And the last thing I put that I see as typical pitfall of private contracts is the radius clauses that we talked about. I think they're unconstitutional, honestly, but it's a way of trying to control. For bigger acts, it maybe makes a little more sense if Taylor Swift is coming to town and she plays 45 venues. I mean, she still would sell all of them out, but somebody else, might not, and a company would want to keep that.
It also hurts smaller venues. I feel like
Yeah.
it doesn't really serve communities, local music communities, and those who maybe can't, get the big venue experience,
Yeah. Yeah. So I think that's kind of it for my little list. I don't necessarily think that that's conclusive, and it also just more or less reflects my particular experience. Like I said, most of my experiences with union contracts, so it may be that there are different elements out there that I'm not aware of, but a lot of these things are very similar no matter what kind of contract it is. And I think a lot of the issues around negotiating are exactly similar. I'm going to reiterate this because I think it's important, but the biggest piece of advice I think I could give to anybody that's wondering about negotiating is that whether you know it or not, you are the one that's setting the terms by your body language, by your belief. If you walk into a situation really, really believing that you're worth this amount, and it's not an impassioned belief, it's not something you have to work yourself up to, it's just a belief like, yeah, a car is worth this, I'm worth this, and you just walk into that situation, then you're actually providing an opportunity for the other person to engage your services. You're helping them. If you walk into there thinking, well, I want this, but I'm not really, I'm hoping to get this or whatever, then you're communicating that as well. And that's what is going to end up, that's where your negotiations are going to end up. So make sure that you understand what you need. And I would say, it's okay to start with like a wish list that you're never going to get, but start there so you have clear understanding. And then walk into there with the terms that you need. If they say no, then you talk to them, you figure out something that works for you, something that works for them. But again, the thing that really drives negotiations is the more or less the attitude that you have. If I'm negotiating with you, for instance, and I can tell that you're trying to tell me something that you don't really believe in, that tells me that that's something that you're going to give up sooner or later.
Ugh.
But if I could tell that this is something that you really believe in, then it tells me as a negotiator, we're not going to get past that with you. In both cases, I don't really care. I'm fine with it. You know what I mean? That's the tricky part, is that we think that we're hurting somebody's feelings by holding a line as to what we expect or what we need. If you are, you're not doing business, or they're not doing business. It really is a business reality, and it's okay to be that.
You know, there's another thing about that too, is that sometimes people just want to know what they owe you.
Mhm.
You know, things went down, whatever, things have changed. Like, what does it say? We're going through all the contracts with all the vendors.
Yep.
What do I owe you? Like, what did you say? Oh, you didn't say anything? Well, we owe them nothing. So it's, you
Yep.
know, it's like, if we can't figure it out, we just have to check it off a list. We don't even care how much it costs. We just need to cross our T's and dot our I's,
That's
you
right.
know?
That's right. The worst, the thing that I've seen that's the saddest thing to see is people negotiating against themselves. A vendor will come
Right.
after the fact and say, I know we did overtime. What do we owe you? And somebody says, well, we'll give it to you for this. And yeah,
Like,
and it's like,
was
that
that
person-
overtime? I didn't even know.
yeah, right, exactly. And the thing is, you know, if you could dissect that, that person was willing to pay for it. They were ready, and that money was on the table. You just left money on the table.
Yeah, it's business. It's professional.
It's business.
Yeah.
And it doesn't have to be impassioned to be in that position. You don't have to work yourself up to be there. It's just a reality.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Ah.
Amen. Thank you
Well,
so much.
Kale, this was absolutely wonderful. And thank you so much for just shedding some really wonderful light on how to protect ourselves and how to kind of set up a situation where it's you know, smooth sailing and
We hope. The best
you
case
know, for
scenario.
the best. And also thank you so much to Tracy and Ariel who joined
Yeah,
us today.
thank you.
Um,
Oh, that's very sweet.
this was
That's awesome.
it was, yes. Oh,
Oh,
yeah.
nice.
I mean, it would be, it's just, it's so inspiring. I'm like,
Yeah.
what can we make like a template for
Yeah.
affiliates and like
Yeah.
have some different types of contracts to build out, you know, available. But you have really lit up a bunch of, you know, areas that needed shedding light on. And I personally feel so much more informed. But
Me too.
yeah.
And I
That's
want to
very
say too,
powerful.
I'm more, I love helping people with this. I love talking to people about this, especially musicians. It's a passion of mine. So Ariel and Tracy, if you ever get to a point where you want some advice about something you're looking at, please don't hesitate to reach out to me. I would love to help you out if I can. And that goes for anybody else.
It's
I mean,
very generous.
in a
Thank you
large
so
part, it's my
much.
job. So it's,
I
I know you think I'm being nice, but it's also my job. So I'm not really being nice.
Awesome. Well, thanks again. And we will post this along with sending you all a survey. And thank you again for being here. And thank you again,
Thank
Kale.
you.
All
Thank you.
right. See you
Mhm.
soon.
Bye, y'all.
Bye.